Hello everyone, and welcome back to part 10, I think? Maybe? Or it could be part 11, actually. I can't remember, I've completely lost track at this point. And I'm thrilled to say that since the last episode, the myriad of technical difficulties that I was battling have at last been resolved. The breach has been sealed, and the plateau is officially back online. And that being the case, we are now free to press on with the Conlanging. So, another big thanks to all the patrons, and without further ado, let's get into it. So, we've got quite a bit of follow-up from last time. First of all, with these provisional affixes for the three cases, I assigned each of these phonological forms to each case essentially arbitrarily, but I realized that with this ura suffix that I have for the genitive, when that combines with the verbal noun, that will pretty much always result in a stressed ur in the final syllable, or some variant of that based on the vowel harmony. And I'm fine with that on principle. It's just that I'd assign this to the genitive, and remember the genitive is becoming the accusative, which also has a bunch of other functions, so I reckon that this case is going to be by far the most common case, and if it is, that means that basically every other word is going to end in a stressed ur, which I'd prefer if there was a little bit more variety than that. So I think I'm going to switch these up and swap the accusative and the genitive endings. Another minor thing I'm going to change. So when we said that all of these sounds are lost, and they lengthen the preceding sound, and then the voiceless pharyngeal fricative and the voiceless velar fricative both go to H. I realized that after that change, that will give us quite a lot of sequences of a consonant immediately followed by H, which in the case of resonance, if it's a resonant plus an H, I quite like that. In fact, that sort of fits with the phonesthetic I'm going for. But with obstruents, I'm not really sure how stable that is. Like, I'm not sure how long a word like atha or akha would last for. I think it's more likely that that would result in gemination or aspiration or something like that. Not saying it's impossible for it to last, it's just not really what I'm going for with this language. Would it be too much of a cop-out to implement gemination again? If we say H is lost when following obstruents and then geminates the preceding sound, does that make sense? It kind of fits with the same theme. I'm fine with H coming in coda position and occurring before obstruents. I think that's fine. Something like ahta is fine. I'm going to go with that for now, but I might revise it again a bit later. And now we come to the elephant in the room. So from the beginning, I was struggling to decide on a system of anaphora and referent tracking that would give us additional forms for the auxiliary verb. And I messed around with the idea of gender, but after dwelling on it for a while, it just didn't really seem right for the way I was doing things. I essentially didn't want to just tack on gender just for the sake of having gender. So I decided instead that I would go with obviation. But then, in the past couple of episodes, in contriving this whole inverse number malarkey, it sort of naturally progressed into this class system that sort of built into everything in order for the inverse number to actually work the way I want it to. And so, that being the case, I'm not really sure that obviation makes very much sense anymore. Now obviation is feeling to me like the thing that's just being tacked on for the sake of it. And honestly, along with the fact that I'm still struggling to understand exactly how it works, I think I'm going to actually get rid of it and go back to square one and settle on gender again. Yep, this sort of thing happens a lot in the planning stage. Very often I sort of flip-flop back and forth with ideas before I actually settle on anything, as you've probably gathered by now. So that means if we're going with gender, then for the auxiliary, instead of having a distinction between third-person proximate and third-person obviate, if we wanted to derive additional verb forms, we could just say that the original pronouns for the three classes, for humans, animate, and inanimate, got incorporated directly into the verb. So then we'd have separate forms for each of our three classes that would agree in gender with the subject. Yeah, I think that just streamlines things a whole lot, and I do really like the idea of case markers that also mark for obviation, but I think I'm going to table that and save that for another language. So another thing that occurred to me recently, imperatives. Now I was thinking about exactly how imperatives might evolve, and there's a couple of different ways to do it. You can use some sort of emphatic verb like do or go or something like that. In fact, we even kind of have that in English, where you can say something like go do your homework or something, where that go is kind of an imperative marker, kind of. But in a lot of languages, the imperative doesn't really have its own distinct form, they just use the second person verb form. And that got me thinking that in this language, you remember that the imperative is the only verbal construction that doesn't use the auxiliaries, right? So the imperative inflects for aspect but not tense, so it's just derived from the original perfective and imperfective system from the Proto-Lang. So what if the second person pronouns became incorporated into the imperative? Then that would mean the imperative is the only lexical verb form that takes any subject marking, which at this point it doesn't even look like subject marking, it just looks like an imperative marker. And if the second person singular and plural got incorporated separately, then that would give rise to two different forms for the imperative. And in fact, if we're going with this idea that there's a distinction between second person informal and second person formal that derived from an original singular versus plural distinction, then would that give us a separate formal versus, I guess, hortative imperative? I think that's the right word, or is it jussive? So then we'd have a standard imperative that's like, do it, and then we'd have, I'm going to say hortative for now, that would be like, let's do it. Or we could say that by the time the second person pronouns are incorporated into the imperative, they can be reanalyzed as just forms of the imperative, so it would retain just a standard singular versus plural distinction. And then, because we've still got the pluractional down here, that's a suffix or some other affix that goes onto the lexical verb to mark a plural subject. Either way, I think that's pretty cool, and I'll decide which one when we get to actually evolving stuff. But the other thing I realized was that, as I say, the imperative is the only verbal construction that doesn't use the auxiliaries. And you remember we've established that the lexical verbs are derived from verbal nouns, which means that their direct objects are in the old genitive. But the imperatives don't work like that. The imperatives are just regular old verb forms, and therefore their objects are marked in the accusative, or what was the accusative in the Proto-Lang. But then once the genitive, because of the auxiliary verb constructions, essentially takes over the role of the genitive, and the accusative takes a back seat and essentially becomes like a weird postpositional type thing, that means the object of the imperative would be marked in the old accusative that is now the postpositional. Which seems really weird from a synchronic perspective, but it makes complete sense with the way we're doing things. This is one of the reasons that I prefer the diachronic approach, because stuff like this just kind of happens. These weird little quirks and idiosyncrasies that just add a lot of depth to the language, because if I was doing this synchronically, if I was just sitting down and just bashing out these verb forms, it would never have occurred to me to be like, okay, let's make the object of the imperative marked in the locative. Why? I don't know. But that's just sort of come about naturally from the way that we're doing things. I think that's really cool. But then there's the other issue that I'm still kind of struggling to wrap my head around. Passives. Because last time I didn't think about what case does the agent of a passive take? Because in most languages, I think I've said this before, in a lot of languages, when you use the passive, you're simply not allowed to state the agent, because that's kind of the point of the passive, is to make the agent less salient. So if you passivize a sentence like, I ate the cake, and it becomes, the cake was eaten, it's impossible to, in the same sentence, say who ate the cake, because that's not important. But in other languages, like English for example, you can use an adposition, like in English it's by. The cake was eaten by me. And in Latin, you use ab plus the ablative. So it's like the cake was eaten from me. And apparently in Swahili, it's really cool, you can use what's essentially the comitative. It's na, which is also the word for and. So it's like the cake was eaten and me. But in our case, because of the way that these auxiliaries have evolved, you remember the lexical verbs are nouns. Now, I roughed in that the mediopassive might have evolved from a verb that means something like to take or to get. So if we had a sentence like, I ate the cake, the auxiliary would mark for tense and for the first person, and then for the perfect tense, the lexical verb would be in the perfective converb, which evolved from the verbal noun plus the genitive. And then cake would take the genitive because it's the direct object of the lexical verb, which is actually a noun. So it would be like, I am being of the eating of the cake. But if we passivize that and say the cake was eaten by me, cake is now the subject, and so the auxiliary would now agree with cake in gender. But then you've got the verb take in there. So how does that work? We could do it like that, where take is now the lexical verb that's rendered as the perfective converb, and then eat is a verbal noun. So it's like, the cake was while taking the eating. And then what we could do, just to make it a full-fledged verb form, since eat is a verbal noun, we could incorporate it into take. So the cake is being having eat taken. That's interesting. Or we could just say that the passive evolved long ago enough that take was just an accepted, like a serial verb construction. You could just stack it behind any verb and it would have a passive interpretation, so we wouldn't necessarily need the verbal noun in there. Again, we'll settle that when we get to actually evolving stuff. But in either case, how would you reintroduce the agent? I can think of a couple of different possibilities. The least controversial option would just be to say that there is a postposition for that, like ab in Latin, or an interesting one in Turkish actually. The way you do it is using the word tarifinden, which literally means from the side of. So if you want to say something was done by me, you say something was done benim tarifinden, which is like from the side of me, like from my side. That's quite a weird one. And if we did go with that, then the agent would be in the accusative, or the old accusative. Because if we're using verb-like postpositions, then the expected case for the object of a postposition would be in the accusative. Another way to do it might be to say that the object of a passivized lexical verb is interpreted as that verb's direct object. So like for our example here, it would be like, the cake was being having eat taken me. And me in that instance would be in the accusative. Which means that once again, the agent would be in the accusative. And the third option that I can think of is that the original postposition that was used to mark the agent of the passive was the same postposition that gave rise to the genitive. So for our example, that would be, the cake was being having eat taken from me. Which with a verb like take, I think kind of makes sense. Because remember we said our genitive case evolved from a postposition that means from. And that would mean the agent is marked in the genitive. Now that is interesting because the direct object of an active verb is also marked in the genitive. So a passive agent and an active object take the same case. So if you've got a pair of sentences, one is active and the other is passive, like, I ate the cake and the cake was eaten by me, the marking for both the nouns in both of those sentences would be identical, and the only way you can tell which one is the agent and which one is the patient is the presence of this mediopassive affix in there. That strikes me as very strange, But I also think it kind of makes sense. And I actually do quite like that, because that gives more credence to the whole Austronesian alignment system that we're kind of going for. Because if these valency changing operations are used as much as I'm imagining they're going to be used for the purposes of salience and information structure, then the nouns could essentially come in whatever order you liked, and you just have to look to the verb to determine who's doing what to whom. So I'm leaning towards that idea, but again, it does feel kind of strange to me. Please do let me know in the comments below which of these three you think would be best. And if anyone knows more about typology or passivization or these sorts of constructions, please let me know if either of these, especially this one, makes any sense. Right, and then, next order of business, going back to these nouns. So I did realize, actually, that with this idea for the construct state in possessive constructions, it occurred to me that if we did that, then that would also affect our verb system, because our lexical verbs are actually nouns, and their genitives are interpreted as their possessees. So that means our lexical verbs, if they had any object, would have to take this marking for the construct state, which is kind of an interesting idea. It would essentially evolve into like some little sort of transitivity marker. But for this language, I'm not sure if I want to go for that. It's just not really in line with what I have in mind, and it would just sort of add extra morphology for no point. That means we're ditching the construct state. And a lot of people were able to answer my question about German. Apparently German does use the dative in possession in conjunction with the preposition von, but it keeps the genitive around for more formal circumstances. We could still use the genitive in possession and rely on word order to distinguish who's the possessor and who's the possessee, but I would still like to have a clarifying strategy available. Now, if it does involve a postposition, we'd expect the object to be marked in the old accusative. But it doesn't have to. It could be that the verb that gives rise to the postposition might just assign the dative to its object, or it could be that it derives from some compound adposition with two separate elements, the second of which gives rise to the dative. Because otherwise the dative isn't actually going to see very much use, because, I'm imagining the vast majority of postpositions will mark with the accusative, which becomes the locative, or I'm going to change that to postpositional. And then, other than a few specialized instances, the dative isn't really used all that much. We could ditch the dative, we could just say that the dative gets lost, but I kind of want to hold on to it, because otherwise we're only going to have two different actual marked cases. So if we go with that then, that the dative is used in the possessive construction, then what postposition would be involved? Well, where does the dative itself come from? So we had over here that the dative gives rise to the imperfective. Now, if you've seen my video on converbs, which came out a few days ago, the imperfective converb most often evolves from case markers that have a kind of locative function. So what if it originally wasn't a dative? What if it used to be a locative? Maybe a sort of locative-dative hybrid, like in Manchu. So in that case, the object of the postposition would be interpreted as at, in, or on the object. What if this postposition then actually evolved from an intransitive verb? What if it was like, for example, to sit? Then that would be like sitting on such and such. So what intransitive verb would give rise to a possessive sense? Probably the most intuitive option would be something like belong, or to be related to. For now, I'm going to stick with that. So those are our three cases, plus the nominative, which is the unmarked one, which means that the standard noun declension will look something like this. But there's also class involved as well, so there'll be three different versions of this for the three different classes. Now, keeping the inverse number thing in mind, we want to make sure that the plural for animate nouns and the singular for inanimate nouns looks as identical as possible. I don't mind there being a couple of irregularities in there, in fact I would prefer that, but I'd still like them to look similar to each other. So all nouns have 3 bits of morphology on them. They've got class, they've got case, and they've got number. So I'm thinking that the first piece of morphology to get properly associated with nouns would be classes. I think the classes would already be, we've pretty much established that the class system is already somewhat evident back in the Proto-Lang, so all nouns would obligatorily occur with some classifier or some, class element that would then very rapidly get sucked into the noun itself and just become a suffix. And then after that, we've already said as well that the cases, or at least the things that are going to give rise to cases, are already present in the Proto-Lang. I'm thinking they might exist kind of like case particles, like in Japanese or Manchu, where they're not actually properly associated with the nouns yet. So then the case suffixes get added on, which means that this is the order with which the affixes will come. The separate affixes for number get added on later when the class systems start getting reduced and things start becoming ambiguous. So this then would be the order that the affixes will occur on the noun. And then with all the sound changes, they should get fused together. But since the number marking is coming at the very end, that should be pretty easy to manipulate into inverse number. What do adjectives agree with? When did adjectives evolve? I'm thinking that the adjectives might have evolved before the number marker got affixed, which means that the adjectives would agree in class and case, but not necessarily number. So by the time the singulative, dual, and plural got affixed onto the nouns, adjectives were already distinct from nouns, and so that association didn't happen. We've already decided that adpositions are pretty universally going to be verb-like, and as this example sort of illuminated, if the postposition descends from a transitive verb, then it will mark its object with the postpositional case, but if it descends from an intransitive verb, it marks it in the locative, which, by the way, I should change that. There we go, locative. So those are going to be the default cases that adpositions will assign. Or as well, actually, some intransitive verbs might assign the genitive, just depending on the semantics of the verb. Boy, the genitive really is going to be used a lot in this language because it's already going to be used to mark direct objects, but it's also marking the occasional postposition, and it's kind of the default marking for possession when you're not using this locative thing, and it may also be marking the agent of the passive. Which, by the way, looking at this now, I originally had there be a separate mediopassive for animate and inanimate, and same with the antipassive. I could still do that if we stick with the gender idea. We could even have a third one on there if we wanted, specifically for humans, but I'm not really sure that would work, because after all, the whole idea of the passive is it's supposed to be nondescript about the agent, because the agent doesn't matter. And we'll say there's only one passive and one antipassive. And as for this reciprocal thing, so let's go back over that in light of the way that we've decided to do the auxiliary verb constructions. So once again, the idea is that the reciprocal and the reflexive are identical, except that the reflexive takes the mediopassive, whereas the reciprocal does not. But does that actually make sense? A reciprocal would be like, they are fighting each other, whereas the reflexive would be, they are fighting themselves. So once again, the auxiliary takes the marking for tense and for the subject. Fight is rendered as a verbal noun, and because it's the present tense takes the infinitive, which is the verbal noun plus the accusative. So that on its own is they are at the fighting or to the fighting. So to make that a reciprocal, I think I mentioned last time that the word head can often become a reciprocal or a reflexive. So if we went with that, let's say we had noun incorporation again. So they are while head fighting. And for some reason, that gets interpreted as a reciprocal. They are fighting each other. No idea where that interpretation comes from, but apparently it's cross-linguistically quite common. So then for the reflexive is exactly the same construction, except it also has take in there. So they are while head fight taking. Does that make sense? I have no idea. That's not intuitive to me at all, how that comes about. But if I can get away with it, I might just do that. Maybe. And the other quirk to this system was the whole antipassive and passive being from the same marking. With an antipassive, that's no problem, because that would just be really easy to incorporate some little bit of morphology into there. So it's like, I see something, which would be like, I am while one seeing. I'm just using one as an example here, but that's really easy to do. But can we justify that same construction giving rise to a true passive? Once again, with the way we have things here, that would mean that the true passive is identical to the antipassive, except with the word take in there. So that would be, I am at while one see taking. Again, because of the noun incorporation, because noun incorporation just is usually used to background stuff anyway, that does make sense to me. I think for now I'm actually going to stick with this. It's unusual, but I think I can get away with it. And then other than that, are we done? Could we be done? Let's see, we've done nouns, we've done adjectives, we've done adpositions, we've done phonology, we've done verbs. Wow. I think we might be done. Okay, I think, unless there's something I'm missing, in which case we'll catch up with that next time, but I think for now I'm going to say we are officially done with the planning stage. So basically, everything we've done here is just a sketch to give me an idea of how I want this language to end up. But now, this is the part where we go back to the proto-lang and actually evolve it into something that looks like this. So now we can actually afford to evolve some of this stuff and then nail down all of the little quirks that come up along the way. That's quite exciting. Cool. So that means join me next time, I guess, when we'll actually start to create and evolve some words. That ought to be good. That seems like a pretty good place to call it for today, but thank you very much for tuning in, and I will see you next time.